guest tonight is Melanie Finn. And we have the pleasure of launching this brand new book that just went on sale yesterday. Melanie was born in Kenya and moved with her family to Connecticut when she was 12. She attended New York University, graduating with a BA in journalism. Working as a freelance journalist in Asia, Australia, the US, and Africa, she has written a wide variety of subjects, including the Grateful Dead, child soldiers, and scuba diving. It's pretty wide. Her first novel, Away From You, was written in East Africa and garnered much praise. And then while in Tanzania, she met her husband, the wildlife filmmaker Matt Aberhard, and they together made the Nature Disney feature film called The Crimson Wing: Mystery of the Flamingos. Then in 2016, she published her second novel. In this country, it was published as A Gloaming. In the UK, it was published as Shame. And an interesting aside, on her website, her 3 novels are pictured, and the covers for the UK versions are very different than the US versions. So there's an interesting conversation about cover art in there. So the Gloaming was one of the Norwich Bookstore's favorite books of the year. It was also a New York Times notable book and a finalist for the Vermont Book Award and the Guardian's Not the Booker Prize. So we weren't alone in our extreme praise. This brand new novel is set in Vermont, for a change. It's called The Underneath, and it's really an exploration of the ambiguity of evil. But not always what we read in the headlines, but just sort of the everyday, mundane, close to home savagery. That's a word I picked up from a reviewer, but it makes the book sound bleak, but it's really not. Because Melanie really writes very perceptive and unique portraits of the individuals in her novel. So without further ado, please help me welcome Melanie Finn.
Thank you to Liza and the Norwich Bookstore. What a great resource. And I'm also really grateful for the timing of this, because I like to have a glass of wine at 6. So it's a real crush when you have a book reading at 6, because it's like, do I drink before? Do I have to wait till after? So 7 is great, like 1 glass of wine, perfect.
We feel the same way.
Good. I'm glad I'm not alone. Okay. The Underneath, I can't quite remember how I came to the idea of The Underneath. Books come from these strange, you're like a magpie, they come from these strange disparate points, and then they kind of cohere. I was house sitting for some people actually here in Vermont, and they had this weird closet in one of the bedrooms, and I looked inside and there was very bizarre handwriting on the walls, like violent, scary stuff, and what looked like a fist mark going through the wallboard. And so I was really perplexed by this, because I knew these people were kind of considered upstanding members of the community. They were really lovely, educated, they had lovely kids. And yet here was this strange closet in their house. And that was before I had kids. So I didn't really understand the sort of dichotomy when you become a parent, this sort of parallel life that you begin to lead, which is the public life, where you show up on time for school, your kids have their lunches, they're clothed, they're reasonably clean. Other people's kids, mine not so much, but then you have this other struggle, as I can only speak as a mother, but where you're trying to find this boundary between being selfless, which is what's expected, and being selfish, which is to retain some part of yourself in this morass of motherhood. And it can feel like a bitter struggle at times. And so I was fascinated by these secret lives that most of us are leading in our houses, and how we try and make the seamless connection between that secret life and our public life. Obviously, some of us, it's less of a breach than for other people. But that was sort of the idea that the book started with. Just to give you a quick summary, the main character, Kay, is a former journalist. She's not me. But you do write from what you know. So Kay and her husband, Michael, a filmmaker, not my husband, and their family rent a summer house in Vermont, a very remote part of the Northeast Kingdom, not my house. They're kind of envisioning this idyllic summer of which they're going to repair their marriage, and the kids are just going to kind of go feral in the woods, and it's going to be this great kind of reconfiguring of what they've lost. Well, very, very quickly, after they've only been there for 2 weeks, Michael, the husband, gets called away on an emergency work issue, and Kay is left in the house with her 2 children. And lo and behold, she finds one night this weird little cubby hole in the bathroom where there's some really creepy writing on the wall, and there's a lock on the inside of the door. So the space is obviously a space for somebody to hide in from somebody on the outside of the door. So she becomes obsessed with the idea that something terrible has happened to the family that lived in the house. And she kind of asked a few locals who all in very Vermont style are not really very willing to share any information with somebody who's clearly not from around here. So she begins to suspect that something really bad has happened, and the more she tries to find out, the more stone walls she hits. And because she was a journalist, this only propels her further forward. And in her investigations, she meets a local logger, a young man called Ben, who has come from his own troubled background. His mother was an addict, and he is trying to gain guardianship of another troubled young boy called Jake, whose mother is an addict. So there's also the theme of how we repeat the patterns of our past in this story. So Kay and Ben's stories kind of collide, because it turns out that Ben is also involved in some illicit activities, and he actually knows the people who own the house that she's renting. So the story shifts at that point into really becoming much more of a thriller than I think where it starts out is much more of a novel. So I'll just read 2 sections for you. So the first I'm going to read is Kay, and she takes her kids swimming at Crystal Lake, which I know Aggie and Tom know where Crystal Lake is. I don't know any.
Not part of your lake.
Anybody else in the Northeast Kingdom? Right. So we all know Crystal Lake. Right. It's in Barton. Yeah. Why do I don't? I was like looking through it, going, "What? I don't have my glasses."
There you are.
Am I doing this all right for volume? Okay. Crystal Lake State Park, with its limpid water and long sandy beach swarming with other children, had proven to be their favorite place to swim. Like dogs, Freya and Tom, her 2 children, wanted most to be with others of their kind, making the same easy momentary friendships. While Kay set up a blanket on the grass, Freya and Tom ran immediately to the water. Tom, in particular, had marveled at the freshness, how he could open his eyes under the surface without burning his retinas. A London child, he'd only experienced chlorine, or once, in Hastings, salt. "Mum! Mum!" he'd come running to tell her on their first outing here. "It doesn't have any taste. It's just water." She watched them swim out to the buoys, marking the edge of the swimming zone. Freya, with her long arms like sculling oars, made sure, deft strokes. Tom, the product of multiple swimming lessons, had a workmanlike skill, his feet outboarding behind him. They were good swimmers, she noted. Some of the local kids couldn't even doggy paddle. Out beyond the buoys, the lake spilled placidly south, water skiers and wakeboarders, kayaks and canoes. Around her, other families dabbled infants on the lake edge or fired up the park's cement grills. Hamburgers, hot dogs, potato salad, cigarettes, suntan lotion, beer, the olfactory potpourri of mid-July. Somewhere further along the beach, under the sugar maples, a man laughed, a loud, manly guffaw. Kay saw him, large, round-bellied, bare-chested, waving a pair of barbecue tongs about. He belched, and his son, a square-shaped boy of 10, laughed in the same blunt way, then mimicked the burp. Father and son cackled with joy. Kay sat on her blanket, pulling her hat down to shade her eyes. Out there, rounding the buoy and turning back towards the beach, Freya and Tom swam with their sleek, wet heads. She could hear the burpers still laughing. Another man, tall and lean, entered her view, and for a moment she thought it was Ben Camo. Instinctively, she touched her hand to her hair. As he walked toward her, she could see more clearly now his lankiness, his hair dark because it was wet. He was only 17 or 18. The boy turned to a friend, laughing, and they pivoted towards a group of girls further down the beach. Kay watched them for a while, their new bodies and new voices. They laughed and flirted. Just beyond them, Tom and Freya now on the sand, intent on a sandcastle. She closed her eyes against the sun's bright glare, and she had the impression of Michael. He was there with her, beside her. They were lovers in a hotel room, clean cotton sheets, and her body was lean and brown. He marveled at her. Then the light changed. The sun now surfed the tops of the surrounding hills. There was the slightest shifting down in temperature. Kay startled with the revelation that she'd fallen asleep. She sat up. Though the mass of children had begun to thin out, there was still a dozen or so splashing in the shallows on a flotilla of cheap plastic rafts. Her eye tuned to her children. She'd know them anywhere. But she did not see them. The water beyond the swimming buoys seemed heavy, oily in the evening light. Standing up, she walked to the beach, scanning. Perhaps they had gone to the lagoon around the corner. Perhaps they were up at the swing set. She walked quickly, refusing to panic, but they were at neither place. She ran back to where she had last seen them, then waded into the water. Freya? Tom? But they were not there. She knew this. They were gone. But she shouted again, Freya, Tom! And then turned like a cornered animal, still calling their names. Freya, Tom, Freya, Tom, Freya, Tom, Tom, Freya, Freya. A man was there, the fat burping man. Ma'am, what do they look like? Freya's 8, Tom's 5, blonde, slim, both. She's in a green swimsuit, his is red. They were just here. Don't worry, there's a ton of kids. His hand was on her arm, making the connection. I'll go up to the ice cream stand and check the bathrooms, okay? He peeled away. He must have told other people, check the lagoon, check the parking lot, check the playground. Kay had a sense of purposeful dispersal taking place around her. She kept running, shouting along the shore. Just 20 feet offshore, just beyond the benign sand, the lake got deep. They wouldn't swim out, she was thinking, unless they thought they'd make the far shore, a rocky outlet on the eastern edge, or the docks to the west. But Freya, surely, had a good sense of Tom's limits. He'd never make it that far. She knows better, she knows better. Kay kept thinking this of Freya, even as a new idea formed, that yes, she knows better. She's swimming him out. She's swimming him out far on purpose, a vengeful siren sister, to where choices winnow in the glacial depths. And Kay became certain, even as she lifted her gaze higher and further out beyond the buoys, the glittering slow water, the water skiers cutting the surface. They'd be unable to see two small heads, like otters, the spinning blade of the boat's propeller. Freya, Freya, Tom, Tom. Kay waded further in, the water up to her chest. Kay hadn't loved Freya enough as a baby. Kay had been gone, assignments in Yemen, Congo, Zimbabwe, and when Kay had come home to Nairobi, Freya hesitated to leave the ayah, Kay kneeling down in the hallway, open-armed until Freya conceded, trotting across the floor. and Kay would bury her in, curl her in, but always, always Kay suspected her daughter's sense of obligation. In the deeper water, she realized her mistake. The lower perspective gave her less visual scope. Freya! Tom! Her voice was drowned by the whining of outboards, one in particular heading in her direction. It was the fat man, a little dinghy with a tiny motor on the back. He held out his hand. She stepped in. He leaned towards her, an intimate proximity, to speak over the sound of the engine. Do you think they would be swimming out here? I think so, Kay said. I think they've got some crazy idea. Kids. He rolled his eyes and turned up the throttle, heading for open water. They can't be that far, he said. How long have they been missing? I don't know, she admitted. He looked at her. I was watching them. I was there. They were there, but I don't know. Kay bit her lip. But Freya knows. She knows not to go far. And you're sure they swam out? He said. They didn't go with anyone? Kay turned to him. Anyone. He was anyone. Of all the times Kay had told Freya and Tom not to go with strangers, and she'd done just that. Here she was with a stranger, in a boat, in the middle of a lake, losing sight of shore, a woman who knew better, who knows better, who certainly knows worse. How easy it was to make a bad decision. Then a random thought, completely unhinged, entered her mind. Eamon. Eamon is a really bad character. Eamon had taken her children. He had taken them into the dark woods. A torrent of words. Hammer, squeal, duct tape, tarpaulin, earth, socket, bone, surgical pig. She forced her eyes open, gritted her teeth. The fat man piloted the boat out, slowly nosing toward the shore, then back again to the center of the lake. 20 minutes, half an hour, how long had they been gone? Kay had no concept of time. An hour? Multiply minutes by Tom's doggy paddle. Is that them? The man pointed to a rocky outcrop. Kay could just make out two small figures, 2 points of light. Yes, oh God. Closer in, Kay could see Tom's arms around himself. He was shivering, his face worried and uncertain, and Freya, attempting to cover her fear with a casual jut of the hip. Kay turned to the man. How do I look? He squinted, confused. Do I look angry or worried? You look scared shitless. I don't want to look scared because I'll scare them. She tried a smile. Well, now you look scary, he said. Kay tried again without the smile. Better, he nodded. Try adding some annoyed. They'll know it's all right if you're annoyed with them. Her face felt tight with effort, a mask of skin obscuring the hundreds of muscles pulling on opposite directions, emotions that had only names in other languages like German or Japanese. If she knew those languages, she could express all these feelings in dire conflict with each other. My son went missing in the woods, the man said. It was hours. We were going nuts. Your mind makes up stories, always the worst. It turned out he'd fallen asleep in a pile of leaves. Freya and Tom didn't move. Kay had the sense they were watching her carefully. The man decelerated, the dinghy bumping gently against the rock. Kay held out her hands, one to each child. You want to lift back? Tom grabbed her fingers. His lip wobbled. His eyes were teary. Kay thought he would fall into her arms, but he moved past her and into the boat. The man put a towel round his shoulders. Long swim, huh? As she took Kay's other hand, Frey lowered her eyes. I didn't think it was so far. She was working hard to keep her voice steady, as if nothing was wrong. I had to pull him most of the way in, Freya said. He couldn't swim anymore. She stepped in the boat. Kay took another towel from the man. How grateful she was to him. He was looking at her, and she could feel tears burning in her eyes. He gave her a quick answering smile. Annoyed, he whispered. She blinked away the tears before Freya could see, pulled the towel tightly around her daughter. Have a seat. This nice man will take us back to the beach. I've never been in a boat before. Tom held the gunwale. Thank you, Freya murmured, looking up at the man. Sorry for the hassle. On the way back to the beach, Kay regarded the back of her daughter's head. She wanted to kiss it. She wanted to smack it. She thought about herself in the basement with the hammer. She thought about her daughter out there in the deep water of the lake, the moment when her peevish wish became a terrifying possibility, the moment when she had realized she would not always be good. So, yeah, so I love that scene actually.
It shows.
So strangely, yeah, and then so the second reading is much shorter, and this is just a section of Ben. A logger must know the woods. Oh, hold on a sec, sorry. My children are still out there, right? Tom and Freya? Right. Okay.
Your mother will go check.
No, Mum, I'm sure they're fine. They haven't.
You see them?
No, but they'll be fine. Oh, they're in the store? That's even worse. Okay. So Ben is a logger, like many of our logger brethren, who is really struggling to make a living from logging, and definitely has fallen into some rather lugubrious habits, and he really hates his life. A logger must know the woods he logs. He must map out the species of trees and note the vernal pools, the marshes, the streams. He must take into account the contours of the land, the steep slopes and ridges, ravines and dells. He walks the property for days, marking the boundaries, tagging the trees of value and those destined for the woodchipper. In walking, he sees the delicate lady slipper orchids and the trout lilies and the sun dappling through the poplars. The ferns grow richly on moist soil, sheltering tiny, delicate red efts. There are bullfrogs in the streams, newts and salamanders, and 6 or 7 species of smaller frogs. The trees are private kingdoms for owls, woodpeckers, nuthatches, chickadees, the kinglets, who all survived the brutal winter. And in the undergrowth, the spiny bramble, the twisted bracken, here live the grouse, the oven birds, the juncos. Garter snakes and milk snakes and toads inhabit the leaf litter, the rotting logs, the moss-covered rocks. Ben heard and inhaled this, the living multi-dimensions of the forest. He knew it more intimately than the land's owners, who would never learn to dodge and dance, who would never learn the dodge and dance required to walk in thick woods. They were worried about ticks. They didn't like the way brambles grabbed their clothing and skin. Mud sullied their expensive hiking boots. Walking the woods, Ben found old ruins, coils of rusted barbed wire, and the stone walls a farmer took years to build a century ago. He often thought about those who'd first cleared the land, tree trunks the size of houses. It would take a year to clear an acre. Those men and women spent their lives clearing the forest year upon year, peeling it off the face of the earth. And in exchange, the earth took them, took their children, year upon year. All that effort, Ben thought, all that fretting, and the woods grow back, not the big trees anymore, but a clear-cut forest, but a clear-cut can reforest in 30 years. He found junk too, messes left by other loggers, steel cables, plastic oil buckets, fuel drums, beer cans, or trash, tires, kids' toys, rusted fridges. The forest could not ingest such things, but embraced them with lichen and creepers. Mice claimed an old mattress, and wasps built their paper palace in a discarded pet crate. Sometimes Ben brought a packed lunch, and he'd find a quiet place away from the deer flies or the black flies. He might open a beer or two. Once, a young bear ambled out of the shade and began scratching her back against a maple. When she noticed Ben, she gave him an annoyed look, as if she knew the rules required her to give up her scratching and run away. But the time always came. The task was always at hand. It had to be done. And Ben climbed into the cabin of the fellow buncher. He put on his ear protection and turned the ignition. The great machine trembled beneath him, all around him. The creatures of the forest had no reason to fear the noise, for they could not know what it meant. The generation that might remember was gone, the memory collectively erased. People didn't understand this about logging. They didn't want to know the consequences. They thought the foxes and birds and snakes just moved somewhere else, but they died, every last one. 1,000 small deaths of hunger or animal war, bodies that never accumulated but dissolved into the earth or into the bellies of others further up the food chain. Then became their death, and there was no accounting for the dead of the forest. He turned the fellow bunch northeast of the landing, attacking a copse of Ted and Elvie's beautiful old birch. The machine's hydraulic arms grabbed the first birch in their steel embrace, and the sword jutted out from the base and severed the tree from its roots. The spinning steel spines of the debrancher ripped up the length of its pale white trunk, amputated its limbs, and then down again, rendering it smooth. 30 seconds from living tree to log. So, anyway, okay. It does have a happy ending, so the forest grows back and all the squirrels come back.
That
So
was beautiful.
thank you.
Why was the man fat?
I don't know. Have you been to Crystal Lake in the summer? Because
No, I just thought it was a conscious decision.
I don't know. I mean, I think you just see like everyone's got their shirts off, and there's a lot of large people enjoying the summer, and I think that, I mean, that's why you like Crystal Lake, because people are just having a good time. It's not, you know, nobody is concerned about what they're wearing or what they're doing. It's just genuinely this wonderful place where kids are happy and people are having barbecues. And that's why I chose to set the scene there, because there's no pretension, right? And I think that that's really what I wanted to set the scene, is that she's just relaxed and she thinks it's safe, but of course it's not. So anyway.
No, wasn't there an Africa theme with it too?
Oh yeah, so Kay, she's a former journalist, and one of the things she's trying to do over the summer is write her memoir, because after having kids, funnily enough, her career went in the toilet, and strangely, so she's tried to get back into writing, but it's been incredibly difficult because of course, the whole world of journalism has changed so much, even in the last 10 years, that the freelance work has become very difficult to make a living at, or even really be worthwhile. So she's decided to write her memoir. So one of the things she's doing in this idyllic Vermont farmhouse is writing a memoir, and that involved tracking down a genocidal militia, head of a militia in Africa called General Christmas. And she does, in the flashbacks, she does meet up with General Christmas. And that's, yeah, so that element comes into it too. So.
What kind of research did you have to do before tackling some of the big issues that you tackle in this book?
Two forms of research really. I did know a lot of local loggers, and because our land was just hideously logged when we bought it, and so I had kind of seen what bad logging could do, and I knew some good loggers, and our forester. So I just asked them, and it was really interesting just to talk to them about some of the tactics that desperate loggers resort to. So that very much becomes part of Ben's character. And then the other research was really, I'm obsessed with local papers, and the Caledonia Record is our local paper up in the Northeast Kingdom, St. Johnsbury area. And so I'm an avid reader, particularly of page 2, which is the obituaries and the police crime plot. So just reading the local paper and really coming to understand the issue with the opioid crisis here in rural Vermont, and in particular places like the Northeast Kingdom and like Rutland, because of where they're located off these main arterial highways, they're really, really hardly hit because it's so easy for drug dealers to kind of set up shop and drop their drugs off. And I don't know what the statistics are now, but I know that there's an enormous number of deaths from opioids in Vermont. We all know it's a crisis. And I wasn't interested so much in the point of view of the addict, but really looking at the sort of, what do you call them, the non-combatants, and how they're affected by the crisis. The kids, children, not just the children as children, but who the children grow up to be, which is, of course, Ben is the adult. His mother was an addict. So I did find out a really interesting statistic. Apparently Vermont has the most number of unsolved murders of any state.
Really?
Yeah. A friend told me, and it's uncorroborated, but he was certain that he was correct. And I guess given that it's such a remote area and we have very limited resources for that, it would make sense in a way. So.
Is that per capita, I hope?
I don't know. Yeah, it must be per capita. Yeah, it's exactly. Otherwise, we'd have like midsummer murders here, right? Like 50 people murdered in a year in one village of Norwich. Every week, there was somebody else murdered.
Love that show.
So, any other questions? Yes.
Was it's steeped in Vermont? Were you in Vermont when you wrote it the whole time, or at home, or were you traveling?
That's a interesting question. This was the first book I actually wrote in the place that I was living. I can't quite understand, but I've only ever been able to write about a place when I wasn't there anymore. I wanted to set something in Vermont because I'm not going anywhere. I'm not leaving for a long time, so it'd be like another 15 years before I would write another book. But I started writing in the summer, and then I wrote through the winter. And as we all know, winter is sort of crazy time here, and I think I definitely went a little mad sitting at my desk, like writing about murder and opioids and weird genocidal soldiers in Africa, and like those short January days, I really thought I was going quite mad, because it's so dark, and where we live really is very isolated. And you do think, what was it like 100 years ago when people lived like this? Just this was how it was. So. Oh well.
You read so well.
Oh, thank you, Bill.
Do you read other people's writings as well?
Well, I read to my kids, and they like the accents that I do, apparently.
You're very, very good.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks. Yeah. I should have bought my glasses, so anyway. I'm trying to think what else I can say, because it's tricky, because nobody else has read it. So. I don't want to tell you what happens.
No. I was just wondering, is a lot of it from what you've experienced, or did you use a lot of, the internet? I mean, research. Was your research, or did it come from things you picked up in your life?
Well, I mean, I think that writers are definitely sort of magpies. We're constantly like picking up little bits and pieces of life, conversations. And I mean, every novel sort of starts from a very personal perspective. And I sort of worry about when my in-laws read this, are they going to think I'm writing about my marriage? Because in the very opening scene, Kay is in the basement, thinking about smashing her husband's head in with a hammer because she's so angry at him. And I'm thinking, oh God, are they? But I think we've all had that point if we've been married where you look at your husband and you're like, I want to kill you. But there's a difference between that feeling. There's a difference between that feeling, which is so powerful and so immediate, and then you know it's going to dissipate. You know, you're not going to follow. You're not going to smash his head in with the hammer. You're not even going to throw a plate at him. It's just going to get over it. But so there's definitely. I was really curious about. I wanted to write about a marriage that had fallen off its tracks, because I think every marriage does. And so, but this isn't my marriage, and they're not my kids, and it's not my house. But one of the great things about being a writer is that you get to explore this other world. You get to be the people that you will never become yourself, because you only have your one authentic life. And as a writer, it's like being a child, like, oh, I'm going to be a police dog today, you know, or I'm gonna be a bank robber. So you can become all of these different people, which is sort of the one luxury of writing. And then, just in terms of research, really the local paper, I really read it every day. I just think it's an amazing catalogue of people's strivings, you know?
The opioid crisis that seems to be going on here, the logging and all of that, was that just talking to friends and people, or?
I think the logging was both. I mean, I had this idea of, you know, like this random idea of how, if I was a logger, I might smuggle drugs to Canada. That's my idea. So, seemed like a really good one. But otherwise, yeah, it was from talking to local people and the opioids. I mean, I did speak with a couple of journalists, one in particular, the Caledonian Record, who covers the opioid crisis, and he was really helpful. But I mean, really, just the paper, because it's there. You know, it's there every day. The kids found in the back of a car while the parents are passed out on the sidewalk. You know, the struggles that people have trying to come clean, the endless new attempts by the state and the federal government to help people overcome addiction. So, yeah. I think part of it is having been a journalist, just really loving the newspaper as that you know, medium. Yeah, and I mean you do, and actually also I taught at the local high school for a year, and that was incredibly eye-opening too, because I saw, you know, a lot of the kids coming from very difficult backgrounds, and you know, poverty-related issues with learning, and so that was interesting, because when you teach, you really are kind of like you're coming in at the ground floor of the community. So yes, Garson.
When you're writing this book, I'd like to know how the story evolves for you. How much are you in control of what your characters do, and how much do they inform you as you are in the process of writing? Do they kind of take over?
Well, it's definitely an odd process. It is both, you're kind of relying on serendipity, but also craft. And the tricky part is that you have to have your arc, your story arc. So you have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. You have to kind of keep momentum so that it doesn't sag in the middle. So you're working on all these different levels of the sort of the story itself, and then you've got these characters, and you've created these people, and they have to be authentic. I think one of the things that I hate more than anything if I'm watching a film or reading a book is sort of like a really intelligent woman comes into her dark apartment and she doesn't turn on the light, you know? And she knows she's being stalked by a crazy man. And then, you know, she goes into the basement without turning on the light. And you're like, come on! You know, she knows the crazy guy's out there. She's not going to go into the basement with no light. So you have this authenticity that you create, and it's like you're stuck in it because you can't just have your character suddenly become an Olympic gymnast. Like, no, they are who they are, and so you often, the hardest part of all is trying to make your characters fit with that story arc that you have, because they have to be doing the same thing. Otherwise, you have your characters going off here, and they, like it. So it's both. It's both believing your characters, making them real, but also constantly trying to figure out how you can bring them back. But also to make the story itself authentic, because the characters have to drive the story. You know, you can't have like Deus Ex Machina, like Godzilla comes in and smashes up some houses. You know, that's great if you write science fiction, but I think if you're writing literary stuff, you know, it really is character driven. So you always have to be bringing everything back to this one path, and it's really hard. I mean, it's crazy. I don't really want to do it again, to be completely honest. I've been out fencing in the black. I choose fencing with black flies really over writing a novel, another book. Yes, John.
So when you look back over your 3 books, do you see any threads or themes that keep creeping in that you didn't plan? Do things show up in all 3 of your books that you maybe can't let go?
I think there's one idea of memory, that memory is this unreliable witness, that we really want our past to be something certain, and our past so much informs who we are and therefore our future. But when you really begin to look at the past, often we've created vast swaths of it. You know, either we remember incorrectly or we remember only from our particular perspective. So if you really look at the past as creating who you are now, you're not on very solid ground. So I think that's definitely something, that idea of the past. And Kay definitely in this book, she's trying to remember her dealings with General Christmas, and she's initially quite dishonest about it, and then she realizes that there's no point. You know, you do have to be honest with your past. So I think that I kind of think also I've moved beyond that now. I'm like less interested, and I'd like to think the next book would maybe not have that particular theme. So anybody else? Anything? Oh, well, thank you for coming.